Chapter 2, Towards the Characterization of the Acts which confer meaning. 17 Illustrative mental pictures as putative meanings. We have oriented our concept of meaning, or meaning intention, towards the phenomenological character essential to an expression as such, which distinguishes it descriptively in consciousness from a merely sounded word. Such a character is, on our view, possible, and quite often actual, though the expression does not help us to know anything, does not stand in the loosest, remotest relation to sensualizing intuitions. It is now time to take up our stance towards a widely held, perhaps almost dominant conception, which, as against our own, sees the whole role of the expression, with all its living meaning, in the arousal of certain images which regularly accompany it. To understand an expression means, on this view, to meet with pertinent mental pictures. Where these are absent, an expression is void of sense. These mental pictures are themselves often said to be the meanings of words, and those who say so, claim to be getting at what ordinary speech means by the meaning of an expression. It shows the retarded state of descriptive psychology that such speciously obvious doctrines should be entertained, and entertained despite long-standing objections urged against them by unprejudiced thinkers. Verbal expressions are no doubt often accompanied by images, which may stand in an intimate or a distant relation to their meanings, but to treat such accompaniments as necessary conditions for understanding runs counter to the plainest facts. Thereby we know that the meaningfulness of an expression, let alone its very meaning, cannot consist in the existence of such images, and cannot be disturbed by their absence. A comparison of a few casually observed imaginative accompaniments will soon show how vastly they vary while the meanings of words stay constant, and how they often are only very distantly related to the latter, whereas true illustrations, which genuinely carry out or confirm the meaning intention of our expression, can often only be evoked with difficulty or not at all. Let a man read a work in an abstract field of knowledge, and understand the author's assertions perfectly, and let him then try to see what more there is to such reading than the words he understands. The circumstances of observation are most favorable to the view we reject, since an interest in finding images tends psychologically to evoke images, while the tendency to read back the findings of reflection into the original situation makes us include all new images which stream in during the observation in the psychological content of our expression. Despite these favoring circumstances, the view we oppose, which sees the essence of the meaningful in accompanying imagery, must at least cease to look for introspective confirmation in the sort of case in question. Take, for example, well-understood algebraical signs, or complete formulae, or verbal propositions such as every algebraical equation of uneven grade has at least one real root, and carry out the needful observations. To report my own findings in the last case, I see an open book which I recognize as Serit's algebra. I see the sensory pattern of an algebraical equation in Ternerian type, while accompanying the word root, I see the familiar one. I have however read the sentence very many times and have understood it perfectly, without experiencing the slightest trace of accompanying images that have anything to do with its presented object. The same happens when expressions like culture, religion, science, art, differential calculus etc. are intuitively illustrated. We may further point out that what we have said applies not only to expressions which stand for highly abstract objects, mediated by complex relations, but to names of individual objects, well-known persons, cities, landscapes. A readiness for intuitive representation may be present, but it remains unfulfilled at the moment in question. 18. Continuation of the above. Arguments and argumentes. Should someone object that there are highly evanescent images even in such cases, that a mental picture emerges only to disappear forthwith, we reply that the full understanding of words, their complete living sense, persists after such an image has vanished, and cannot therefore consist in its presence. If the objector shifts to saying that the mental image has become unobservable, perhaps always was so, but that, whether observable or not, it still exists, and makes continued understanding possible, we need not be in doubt as to our answer. We reply that whether or not such an assumption is necessary or plausible on grounds of genetic psychology, this is not anything that need be gone into here. It is quite irrelevant to our essentially descriptive question. Let us grant that there often are unobservable images. Despite this, however, an expression can quite often be understood, and quite observably so. But surely it is absurd to suppose that an abstract, sense-making aspect of an image should be observable, while the whole complete, concrete image experience remains unobservable. How does the matter stand, further, in cases where our meaning is absurd? Unobservability can here not depend on the contingent limits of mental capacity, since such an image cannot exist at all. If it could, it would provide us with a self-evident guarantee of the possibility, the semantic consistency, of the thought in question. It can, of course, be pointed out that we do, after a fashion, illustrate even absurdities, such as a straight line enclosing a space, or triangles the sum of whose angles is greater or less than two right angles. In metageometric treatises there are even drawings of such forms. No one would, however, dream of taking intuitions of this sort as truly illustrating the concepts in question, or of letting them pass as owning such verbal meanings. Only in cases where the image of a thing meant is really adequate to it, are we tempted to seek the sense of our expression in such an image. But if we rule out absurd expressions, which nonetheless have their sense, our image is normally adequate. Even Descartes cited his Chiligan to shed light on his distinction between imaginatio and intellectio. Our imaginative idea of a Chiligan is no more adequate than our images of space enclosing straight lines or intersecting parallels. In both cases we have rough, merely partial illustrations of a thing thought of, not complete exemplifications. We speak of a closed straight line, and draw a closed curve, thereby only illustrating the curvature. In the same fashion we think of a Chiligan, while we imagine any polygon with many sides. We need not look for recondite geometrical illustrations to prove the inadequacy of illustration even in the case of consistent meanings. It is a well-known fact that no geometrical concept whatsoever can be adequately illustrated. We imagine or draw a stroke, and speak or think of a straight line, and so in the case of all figures. The image everywhere provides only a foothold for intellectio. It offers no genuine instance of our intended pattern, only an instance of the sort of sensuous form which is the natural starting point for geometrical idealization. In these intellectual thought processes of geometry, the idea of a geometrical figure is constituted, which is then expressed in the fixed meaning of the definitory expression. Actually to perform this intellectual process may be presupposed by our first formation of primitive geometrical expressions and by our application of them in knowledge, but not for their revived understanding and their continued significant use. Elusive sensuous pictures function, however, in a phenomenologically graspable and describable manner, as mere aids to understanding, and not as themselves meanings or carriers of meaning. Our conception will perhaps be censured for its extreme nominalism, for identifying word and thought. To many it will seem quite absurd that a symbol, a word, a sentence, a formula should be understood, while in our view nothing intuitive is present beyond the mindless sensible body of thought, the sensible stroke on paper etc. But we are far from identifying words and thoughts, as our statements in the previous chapter show. We do not at all think that, where symbols are understood without the aid of accompanying images, the mere symbol alone is present. We think rather that an understanding, a peculiar act experience relating to the expression, is present, that it shines through the expression, that it lends it meaning and thereby relation to objects. What distinguishes the mere word, as a sense complex, from the meaningful word, is something we know full well from our own experience. We can indeed ignore meaning and pay attention only to a word's sensuous character. It may also be the case that some sensible feature first arouses interest on its own account, and that its verbal or other symbolic character is only then noted. The sensuous habit of an object does not change when it assumes the status of a symbol for us, nor, conversely, does it do so when we ignore the meaning of what normally functions as a symbol. No new, independent content is here added to the old. We do not merely have a sum or association of contents of equal status before us. One and the same content has rather altered its psychic habit. We are differently minded in respect of it. It no longer seems a mere sensuous mark on paper. The physical phenomenon counts as an understood sign. Living thus understandingly, we perform no act of presentation or judgment directed upon the sign as a sensible object, but another act, quite different in kind, which relates to the thing designated. It is in this sense giving act character, which differs entirely according as our interest plays on the sensible sign or the object presented through it, with or without representative imagery, that meaning consists. 19. Understanding without intuition. In the light of our conception, it becomes wholly understandable that an expression should be able to function significantly without illustrative intuition. Those who locate the meaning aspect of symbols in intuition must find purely symbolic thinking insolubly enigmatic. Speech without intuition must likewise be senseless to them. But truly senseless speech would be no speech at all. It would be like the rattle of machinery. This we of course meet with in the case of verses or prayers learned by rote and repeated unthinkingly, but not in the cases which here require explanation. Popular comparisons with the squawking of parrots or the cackling of geese, the well-known adage where ideas fail us, words come up at the right moment and so on, are not, soberly considered, to be taken literally. Expressions such as talk without judgment or senseless talk may and should certainly not be otherwise interpreted than such expressions as a heartless, brainless, empty-headed man etc. Talk without judgment plainly does not mean talk unbacked by judgments, but talk backed by judgments not based on independent, intelligent consideration. Even senselessness, understood as absurdity or nonsense, is significantly constituted. The sense of an absurd expression is such as to refer to what cannot be objectively put together. The opposite view can now only take refuge in the strained hypothesis of unconscious, unnoticed intuitions. How little this helps becomes plain if we consider what basic intuition achieves in cases where it is noticeably present. In the vast majority of cases it is by no means adequate to our meaning intention, a fact, which, on our conception, presents no problem. If the meaningful is not to be found in intuition, speech without intuition need not be speech deprived of thought. If intuition lapses, an act like that which otherwise hangs about intuition, and perhaps mediates the knowledge of its object, continues to cling to the sense-given expression. The act in which meaning is effective is therefore present in either case. 20. Thought without intuition and the surrogative function of signs. It should be quite clear that over most of the range both of ordinary, relaxed thought and the strict thought of science, illustrative imagery plays a small part or no part at all, and that we may, in the fullest sense, judge, reason, reflect upon and refute positions, without recourse to more than symbolic presentations. This situation is quite inadequately described if one talks of the surrogative function of signs, as if the signs themselves did duty for something, and as if our interest in symbolic thinking were directed to the signs themselves. Signs are in fact not objects of our thought at all, even surrogatively. We rather live entirely in the consciousness of meaning, of understanding, which does not lapse when accompanying imagery does so. One must bear in mind that symbolic thinking is only thinking in virtue of a new, intentional act character. This distinguishes the meaningful sign from the mere sign, i.e. the sounded word set up as a physical object in our mere presentations of sense. This act character is a descriptive trait in the sign experience which, stripped of intuition, yet understands the sign. It will perhaps be objected to our present interpretation of symbolic thinking that it conflicts with quite certain facts involved in the analysis of arithmetical symbolic thought, facts that I myself have stressed elsewhere, in my philosophy of arithmetic. In arithmetical thought mere signs genuinely do duty for concepts. The reduction of the theory of things to the theory of signs, to quote Lambert, is what all calculation achieves. Arithmetical signs are so selected and perfected, that the theory, combination, transformation etc. of signs can do what would otherwise have to be done by concepts one looked at more closely. However, it is not signs, in the mere sense of physical objects, whose theory, combination etc. would be of the slightest use. Such things would belong to the sphere of physical science and practice, and not to that of arithmetic. The true meaning of the signs in question emerges if we glance at the much favored comparison of mathematical operations to rule-governed games, for example chess. Chessmen are not part of the chess game as bits of ivory and wood having such and such shapes and colors. Their phenomenal and physical constitution is quite indifferent, and can be varied at will. They become chessmen, counters in the chess game, through the game's rules which give them their fixed game's meaning. And so arithmetical signs have, besides their original meaning, their so to say game's meaning, a meaning oriented towards the game of calculation and its well-known rules. If one treats arithmetical signs as mere counters in the rule sense, to solve the tasks of the reckoning game leads to numerical signs or formulae whose interpretation in their original, truly arithmetical senses also represents the solution of corresponding arithmetical problems. We do not therefore operate with meaningless signs in fields of symbolic arithmetical thought and calculation. For mere signs, in the sense of physical signs bereft of all meaning, do duty for the same signs alive with arithmetical meaning. It is rather that signs taken in a certain operational or gamer sense do duty for the same signs in full arithmetical meaningfulness. A system of natural, and, as it were, unconscious equivocations bears endless fruit, and the much greater mental work which our original array of concepts demanded is eased by symbolic operations employing a parallel array of games concepts. Naturally such a procedure must be logically justified and its boundaries reliably fixed. Here we were only concerned to remove confusions readily caused by misunderstanding of the nature of such merely symbolical mathematical thought. If one grasps the sense, set out above, in which the mere signs of arithmetic do duty for arithmetical concepts, or for signs in their full arithmetical meaning, it is clear that talk of the surrogative function of arithmetical signs is irrelevant to our present question, the question whether an expression of thought is or is not possible without an accompaniment of illustrative, instantiating or demonstrative intuitions. Non-intuitive symbolic thought in the sense just mentioned, and symbolical thought in the sense of thought which employs surrogative operational concepts, are two quite different things. 21. A difficulty regarding our necessary recourse to corresponding intuitions in order to clarify meanings or to know truths resting on them. One might here ask, if the sense of expressions functioning purely symbolically lies in an act character which distinguishes the understanding grasp of a verbal sign from the grasp of a sign stripped of meaning, why is it that we have recourse to intuition when we want to establish differences of meaning, to expose ambiguities, or to limit shifts in our meaning intention? Again one might ask, why, if our conception of meaning is right, do we employ corresponding intuitions in order to know purely conceptual truths, i.e. truths known through an analysis of meanings? One can say in general, that in order to be quite clear as to the sense of an expression, or as to the content of a concept, one must construct a corresponding intuition. In this intuition one sees what the expression really means. But an expression functioning symbolically also means something, and means the same thing as an expression intuitively clarified. Meaning cannot first have been acquired through intuition, otherwise we should have to say that much the greater part of our experience in speaking and reading is merely an external perceiving or imagining of optic and auditory complexes. We need not again stress that this plainly conflicts with the phenomenological data, that we mean this or that with our spoken or written signs, and that this meaning is a descriptive character of intelligent speech and hearing, even when these are purely symbolic. Our first question is answered by observing that purely symbolic meaning intentions often do not clearly keep themselves apart, and do not permit of the easy, sure distinctions and identifications which are needed for practically useful judgments, even if these are not self-evident. To recognize differences of meaning such as that between moth and elephant, requires no special procedures. But where meanings shade unbrokenly into one another, and unnoticed shifts blur boundaries needed for firm judgment, intuitive illustration naturally promotes lucidity. Where an expression's meaning intention is fulfilled by divergent, conceptually disparate intuitions, the sharp difference in the direction of fulfillment shows up the cleavage of meaning intentions. Answering our second question, we recall that all self-evidence of judgment, all realized knowledge in the strong sense of the word, presupposes meanings that are intuitively fulfilled. Where there is talk of a knowledge springing from the analysis of the mere meanings of words, more is meant than these words suggest. The knowledge meant is one whose self-evidence calls only for pure representation of the conceptual essences, in which the general word meanings find their perfect fulfillments. All question as to the existence of objects corresponding to such concepts, or falling under such conceptual essences, is ruled out. But these conceptual essences are not the verbal meanings themselves, so that the phrase is based purely on the concepts, essences, and springing from a mere analysis of word meanings, are only by equivocation equivalent. Conceptual essences are rather the fulfilling sense which is given when the word meanings, i.e. the meaning intentions of the words, terminate in corresponding, directly intuitive presentations, and in certain cogitative elaborations and formations of the same. Such analysis is not therefore concerned with empty thought intentions, but with the objects and forms by which they are fulfilled. What it therefore offers us are not mere statements concerning elements or relations of meanings, but evident necessities concerning the objects thought of in these meanings, and thought of as thus and thus determined. These discussions point to a field of phenomenological analyses which we have already repeatedly seen to be unavoidable, analyses which bring self-evidence into the a priori relations between meaning and knowing, or between meaning and clarifying intuition. They will therefore also have to bring complete clarity into our concept of meaning, both by distinguishing meaning from fulfilling sense, and by investigating the sense of such fulfillment. 22 varying marks of understanding and the quality of familiarity. Our conception presupposes a certain separation, even if not quite a sharp one, among the act characters which confer meaning even in cases which lack intuitive illustration. One cannot indeed think that the symbolic presentations which govern the grasp or the significant application of signs are descriptively equivalent, that they consist in one undifferentiated character, the same for all expressions, as if only the sound of the words, the chance sensuous carriers of meaning, made all the difference. Examples of equivocal expressions readily show that we can effect and can recognize sudden changes of meaning, without in the least needing accompanying illustrations. The descriptive difference, here evidently apparent, cannot be the sensuous sign, which remains the same, it must concern the act character, which is specifically altered. One can likewise point to cases where meaning remains identical while a word changes, in the case, for example, of mere differences of idiom. Sensuously different signs here count as equivalent. We perhaps even speak of the same word, only occurring in different languages. They at once greet us as the same, even before reproductive fancy can furnish images that illustrate their meaning. Such examples reveal the untenability of the view, plausible at first, that the note of understanding is no more ultimately than what real 2 called the character of familiarity, and what Hofting 3 not so suitably called the quality of familiarity. 4 words not understood are just as capable of coming before us in the form of old acquaintances. Well memorized Greek verses stick in our memories longer than our understanding of their sense. They appear familiar but are no longer understood. The missing grasp often comes in a flash afterwards, possibly some time before mother tongue translations or other aids come up in memory, and the note of understanding now adds its obvious novelty to the note of familiarity, not altering the content sensuously, yet giving it a new mental character. One may similarly recall the way in which the reading or recitation of familiar poetry, unthinking at first, suddenly becomes charged with understanding. There are countless other examples which make evident the peculiar character of understanding. 23. A perception is connected with expression and with intuitive presentations. The grasp of understanding. 5. In which the meaning of word becomes effective, is, insofar as any grasp is in a sense an understanding and an interpretation, akin to the divergently carried out objective interpretations in which, by way of an experienced sense complex, the intuitive presentation, whether percept, imagination, representation etc., of an object, for example an external thing, arises. The phenomenological structure of the two sorts of grasp is, however, somewhat different. If we imagine a consciousness prior to all experience, it may very well have the same sensations as we have. But it will intuit no things, and no events pertaining to things. It will perceive no trees and no houses, no flight of birds nor any barking of dogs. One is at once tempted to express the situation by saying that its sensations mean nothing to such a consciousness, that they do not count as signs of the properties of an object, that their combination does not count as a sign of the object itself. They are merely lived through, without an objectifying interpretation derived from experience. Here, therefore, we talk of signs and meanings just as we do in the case of expressions and cognate signs. To simplify comparison by restricting ourselves to the case of perception, the above talk should not be misread as implying that consciousness first looks at its sensations, then turns them into perceptual objects, and then bases an interpretation upon them, which is what really happens when we are objectively conscious of physical objects, for example sounded words, which function as signs in the strict sense. Sensations plainly only become presented objects in psychological reflection. In naive, intuitive presentations they may be components of our presentative experience, parts of its descriptive content, but are not at all its objects. The perceptual presentation arises insofar as an experienced complex of sensations gets informed by a certain act character, one of conceiving or meaning. To the extent that this happens, the perceived object appears, while the sensational complex is as little perceived as is the act in which the perceived object is as such constituted. Phenomenological analysis teaches us, further, that sense contents provide, as it were, the analogical building stuff for the content of the object presented by their means. Hence talk of colors, extensions, intensities etc., as, on the one hand, sensed, and as, on the other hand, perceived or imagined. Examples readily show that what corresponds in the two cases is in no sense the same, but only generically allied. The uniform coloring of a sphere as seen by us, i.e. perceived, imagined etc., was never sensed by us. Signs in the sense of expressions rest on a similar interpretation, but only in their first conception. In the simpler case where an expression is understood, but is not as yet given life by intuitive illustrations, this first conception makes the mere sign appear before us as a physical object, for example as a sounded word, given here and now. On this first conception, however, a second is built, which goes entirely beyond the experienced sense material, which it no longer uses as analogical building material, to the quite new object of its present meaning. The latter is meant in the act of meaning, but is not presented in sensation. Meaning, the characteristic function of the expressive sign, presupposes the sign whose function it is. Or to talk pure phenomenology, meaning is a variously tincture-tact character, presupposing an act of intuitive presentation as its necessary foundation. In the latter act, the expression becomes constituted as a physical object. It becomes an expression, in the full, proper sense, only through an act founded upon this former act. What is true in this simplest case of an expression understood and not as yet intuitively illustrated, must also hold in the more complex case where an expression is bound up with a corresponding intuition. One and the same expression, significantly used with or without illustrative intuition, cannot derive its meaningfulness from different sorts of act. It is certainly not easy to analyze the descriptive situation in certain finer gradations and ramifications that have been passed over here. It is extremely hard to achieve a right conception of the part played by illustrative presentations in confirming meaning intentions or in conferring self-evidence on them, as well as their relation to the characteristic note of understanding or meaning, the experience which lends sense to an expression even in default of intuition. Here we have a broad field for phenomenological analysis, a field not to be bypassed by the logician who wants to bring clarity into the relations between meaning and object, between judgment and truth, between vague opinion and confirmatory evidence. The analysis in question will receive a thoroughgoing treatment later. 6.